All right, welcome everyone to this discussion of part of our Cinema of Conflict and Transformation series from Austin Community College's Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. My name is Shireen Khosropur. I'm a psychology professor at Austin Community College. I'm also director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And I am delighted to have you here with us with the curator and of our series, Dr. Mark Cunningham, professor of film at ACC, and with our distinguished discussant, who I'm delighted to welcome back to ACC, Dr. Alaine Hutson. Did I say your name right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Dr. Hutson has been involved with us in really big capacities. She joined us for a focus group when we were developing our degree program in global studies, which is part of interdisciplinary studies at ACC. She also joined us as we were working on developing the degree again in interdisciplinary studies, but this time in African and African diaspora studies. I won't say too much about her because you'll enjoy more hearing from her directly about where she is, what she does. But I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Mark, and then he will introduce, pass it on to Alaine.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much again. Just to restate what Shireen said, thank you for joining us for this discussion on the film You Will Die at 20. My name is Dr. Mark Cunningham. As Shireen mentioned, I teach in the radio, television, and film department. I got my PhD in film and media studies from the University of Texas at Austin. I did my research interests vary from just film in general, but specifically Black film, Black popular culture, television, kind of run the gamut of all those kinds of things in my work. Currently, hopefully one day I'll be able to say I have this book out as opposed to saying I'm working on it. But I'm in the rewrites now of my book I'm writing on John Singleton, on his movies Boys in the Hood, Poetic Justice, and Baby Boy, the South Central Los Angeles set films. And so I am trudging through the rewrites on that right now. So just in case people had never heard me say these things before, is who I am. And so I would very much kind of pass it over to Dr. Alaine Hutson. And could you please, thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of this discussion. So if you could, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
So thank you for the invitation. And it's nice to, I've tried to do a couple of kind of film series here. Well, not here in my house, but over at HT, and always interesting to kind of pull in kind of different movies and let people see. I usually do movies about Afro-descendant people around the world. So I am a professor of history. I've been here at HT and in Austin since at HT since 2008, and in Austin about the same time. I have a pretty, I was telling Layla, I have a pretty kind of straight line. I went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I was first just kind of bouncing around, finding things to do and to study and just being interested in general, and ran into a professor of history in African history, and then the rest is history. Always knew that I wanted to do a semester abroad. I did my semester abroad in Nigeria, in southern Nigeria, which is mostly Christian or kind of traditional religions, but found out a little bit about northern Nigeria, decided I wanted to take a trip to northern Nigeria, got up there briefly to Kano, and that's where most of my work was centered at the very beginning, in northern Nigeria, in a Muslim context. And from there, actually, I got very interested in a kind of Sufi organization that was very millenarian and that surrounded the Mahdi in the Sudan. And so I've actually been to the Sudan for a very short period of time in a very before the Sudanese revolution, way before the Sudanese revolution, and actually at a very weird period of time, because I was in Egypt trying to get my visa to go to the Sudan when the first the first war happened after Iraq invaded Kuwait. And I went to, and I don't know how many of you know, but Sudan sided with Iraq. And I actually was in the Sudan just about to leave when an Iraqi plane landed and there was a spontaneous anti-American kind of protest because the US was about to engage in, I guess that was called, was that called Desert Storm or Desert something?
Desert Storm, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was kind of there during that time period. It was, yeah, the Sudan was a very interesting and kind of scary, the government at least scary, but I found the people kind of very warm and kind of open. So it was nice to see this film about the Sudan and to kind of see those landscapes, even though I don't know anything about rural Sudan. I mostly have known people from urban areas and mostly from Khartoum. So, but yeah, so I've been kind of interested in the Sudan and actually have had a very, very good friend from the Sudan who studied with me when I was for my year abroad in Nigeria. She was there as her year abroad as well. And she went on to do several things with the UN and other kinds of things. And then we had fallen out of touch. And then just recently, in the last couple of weeks, she found me on Facebook. Oh, wow. And so we've been back in touch again. So that's been very, very interesting. And actually, that was one of the things I was trying to do. I was trying to look up some of the things that she said to me, especially about the Sudanese revolution and the kind of work that she's doing in the Sudan today. So pretty cool. I just rambled, sorry.
So it's fine. No, that's good background information.
That's some of the. And then now I'm engaged in research on people of African descent enslaved on the Arabian Peninsula. And because of that, I've recently been to the National Library at Qatar, pretty much a little bit after it opened. And I need external validation, so I'll just have to tell you that I was the first scholar in residence at the Qatar National Library. Oh, nice. So, and had some interesting things to kind of saw some interesting things about Sudanese people as well, seeing a number of young Sudanese students in Qatar at the time. So
cool. All right. Well, then hopefully you can weave some of that into our discussion here about the film. But before we do that, Shireen, I had something else you wanted to mention to us.
Yes, I forgot to mention, for those of you who are here, and for folks who are watching this within the month of February in 2023, this event is part of Austin Community College's celebrations of Black History Month. And my colleague Layla will put a link in chat for those of you who are here to find your way to the other events that are part of that also celebration. Right. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I mean, Dr. Hutson, you gave us a really good starter point to kind of jump this conversation off. And you were talking about Desert Storm, I remember that all too well. I was in the Marine Corps at the time that was happening. So we were all kind of anxious about the fact that we might be, many of us, more of us would be heading over. So yeah, I remember that time for sure. So in realizing kind of the broadness of the question I'm about to ask you, what more information actually could you give us about the kind of, on Sudanese culture or African culture in particular in that area as it relates to film, and what life was like under kind of a repressive Islamic regime?
Yeah, so and I think it's not just an Islamist regime. It's what life can be like under a repressive regime. Because I have been to Jordan, that does not have an Islamist regime, but is a police state. It just is. It's a police state, even though they are allies and friends to the United States and people that we rely on in the Middle East. And we, in Jordan, I ran into some students who were in the English club who came out I was at a workshop for something I probably shouldn't have been there for people who didn't know very much about Islam, but I had never been to Jordan and that area before, so I was there, and these young people who came out to kind of talk to us and practice their English and to kind of show us things in Amman, just talked about how that there are certain things that you should not say at school in lectures or in discussions with your in classes, because the police can knock on your door that evening if you're not saying the right thing. And while we were there in Jordan that year, I can't remember what year it was now, but while we were there sometime in the 2000s, while we were there, the King of Jordan decided to dissolve parliament. And there was barely any news about it.
Wow. Yes. Man. Crazy.
Parliament was just dissolved.
Just dissolved. Wow.
Yeah. And it was something that happened quite often. And so those are the kinds of things that happen, I think, when you're in a state where things are policed quite heavily. And so I was only in the Sudan for a short period of time, but while I was there, basically at this time period, when you came into the country, you would start noticing that there was somebody who basically was shadowing you. I was not allowed to leave Khartoum. And at first I didn't realize it until I kind of talked to somebody and then kind of realized who I had been seeing over and over again. There was somebody who was basically assigned to see where I was going and what I was doing. It was the first place that I had been where I went to. I had gotten a few names before I got there. I didn't really know anybody there. There was one historian that I wanted to visit, and I was able to visit him and his family, and they were kind of very welcoming to me. And he was Sudanese, but at one point I tried to go to a missionary society of Americans because I like to kind of tap in and see what Americans are doing places. These people were very, very unfriendly. And I think it was because, you don't know what's happening and what somebody might be bringing to your doorstep.
Wow.
But I thought it was very interesting that in the Sudan, especially in Khartoum, they consider themselves to be Arab. And I don't know if anybody noticed in the film at one point when Suleiman is talking to Muzamil, and he says something like, "Oh, my father's in Africa," and he's like, "You're in Africa."
Yeah.
And so there's just been this process, and I think it very much started under kind of the Bashir regime, and probably a little bit before that, but there's just this process where of Arabization, where thinking about themselves as Arabs as opposed to as opposed to Africans, even though they're not always seen that way by Arabs in Egypt, and in other places. Although I'm wondering if that's changing now that they have oil and natural gas.
Mm-hmm.
And but there was very much a difference between my reception in Sudan and my reception in Arab countries. I found in Arab countries that I have never been invited to kind of somebody's house and to some kind of household celebration.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in the Sudan for a very short period of time. I think I was there for like 10 days, maybe 2 weeks or something like that. And I was invited to a wedding and went to a wedding. And that's something that I'm very used to in all places throughout Africa, except for in Egypt, kind of being invited to people's celebrations. And the first time it happened, I was just like, but I don't know these people. They won't want me at this wedding. They're just like, there'll be so many people there, they won't even notice it. And because of kind of the large nature of a lot of these kinds of weddings. And then we'll introduce you, and you're American, and you know these things about Islam. They'll be happy to have you kind of here in this space. And I kind of, and that's the way I found it to be in the Sudan, which so kind of seeing that kind of continuity between other African kind of societies and cultures was very reassuring to me that that's a generality that often holds in many African countries and societies. They at the time that I was there were just a lot of intense politics going on. I stayed at a youth hostel where there were an awful lot of young Palestinian men. And so that made for some intense conversations as an American, but I still kind of, appreciated that certainly America's relationship with Israel, especially kind of back at this time period, it can be something that's very fraught for kind of young Palestinian men. And I wasn't, for young Palestinian men, I'll leave it at that. But but there was just this level of the historian that I went to see. He at times, he had left the Sudan at times, and he left again after I saw him there, because it was just kind of harder for him to do his work just because of the crumbling infrastructure of Khartoum and the isolation that a lot of people found themselves in Khartoum. And it was hard to, the copy machines didn't work in the archives and those kinds of things. So, but then also he had been a target of the of the government in the past as well. So there's just an intensity there that and being tailed by I think it was like two people, two kind of younger men was something that I had never experienced before. So but again, like I said, I don't think it's necessarily an Islamist thing. I think it's from living in a police state.
No. Well, that definitely gives some very much insight into that space for sure. So, I admit my bias up front. I love this movie, You Will Die at 20. I've seen it 3 times now. The Sudanese film industry is not exactly prolific. In fact, right, I think there may have been, just out of the Sudan, I think like not even 10 films probably, right? Just in terms of recognition, widespread recognition to come out. This has certainly been one of the most kind of in terms of traction and being seen, playing on the Criterion channel, certainly being available to us on Canopy. In fact, this was the Sudan's first submission for consideration for the Best International Film for the Academy Awards. It was submitted. It wasn't chosen, much to my disappointment, but there's some other stuff they didn't choose either, like decision to leave, but we won't talk about that. But can you speak to the importance of this in terms of what that might mean for like future Sudanese film output, and really the place that this would be in terms of the part of a discussion of world cinema in general?
I'm not sure I can speak to all of that, but I think that it's, there we go, a little better lighting. I think that it's no coincidence that that this is happening kind of in the context of the Sudanese revolution.
Wow.
And as we talked about before that, I think it might have been very hard to get the kind of equipment that you needed to do a film. Especially if you, and the resources to get that kind of equipment, and to navigate the waters of the administration and what it is you're filming.
Right.
And what it is you're trying to put out to the world. And so it seems that that all of that is made easier after the Sudanese revolution, even though things are still hard in the Sudan, from what I hear, but that layer of kind of fear and kind of treading lightly and wondering if somebody's going to see it as not the right thing and kind of come and question you about it. It seems like that must have been lifted and made it easier for people to engage in this. And then, of course, like I said, the resources that are coming out of, it seems like there are a lot more young people who have an ability to travel, not just as kind of guest workers other places, but also as students with resources. And I was kind of happy, but then also that indicates a level of inequity, I'm sure. But happy to see that they'd be able to engage more in other contexts on a more equal footing with students from Qatar or in other contexts on the Arabian Peninsula.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, I just was the guy who made this film, Amjad Abu Alala, his first film, and to be able to come out this way and really kind of put Sudan cinematically on the map. I just thought it was it's just astounding. Just reading more about the fact that Sudanese film output has not been plentiful, and for him to, like you say, to be able to do this, it does speak to a shift, right? Hopefully, a good shift.
There were a number of things that were kind of captured in the film that I think of when I think about Africa. There's a kind of light, especially I've mostly been places near the Sahara Desert, and there's just this kind of quality of light that has this kind of goldenness, probably from the color of the sand in the air or something, or bouncing off of these kind of desert and Sahel ecologies, I guess, that gives this kind of quality to the light that I haven't seen in kind of other contexts or other continents. And I thought he captured that got captured very well in the cinematography. I like that very opening scene of kind
with
of
the vulture and all of that is nice.
People kind of streaming to the sheikh, and so I just thought, and then also things that I think of as being very particular to the Sudan and kind of really deep Sudanese history. So the way in which the huts have this kind of pyramidal, but very kind of skinny pyramidal kind of shape to them,
Mhm.
which hints at the kind of skinny pyramids that you get from ancient Nubia,
Yeah.
in the Sudan as well.
Mhm.
That just seemed to be particularly Sudanese to me. I could be wrong. I'm
Yeah.
not an archaeologist or an architect, but that's
But that
the
parallel is
thing I
there.
thought about when I saw them.
Yeah. But now that you mentioned that, I mean, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, just how beautiful, the cinematography is. And this movie is strikingly photographed. And like you mentioned, the way the sun is shot, so many other different things that Alala is able to capture with this film. And, I wanted to ask, like, to what degree do you think filming the Sudanese landscape in this way kind of might reshape the way Africa is seen globally, particularly in American culture? I think a lot of times in American film product, Africa gets portrayed or thought of a certain way. And so what does a film that, specifically coming from an African filmmaker about its place, how does that help to reshape and change the way American culture or any other culture might see that landscape in your opinion?
Sure, because like I said, I know the Sudan best for its urban context.
Mhm.
And when I was there a million years ago, that context was was kind of very broken down.
Mhm.
And I don't know how that might have changed with this newfound wealth and prosperity, but and kind of a better sense of peace, I think there, and not having to be under that kind of intense strain of repressive regime.
Mhm.
But and so I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how people would see it other than, oh, that's just a hut or something like that. And some of them might all look the same to people. I'm not sure. But but the other thing is that I think one thing that I think is good is if people can see the landscape in Africa, because I think people are often like, oh, it's jungle. It's just like,
Mhm.
that's a terrible term. It's a tropical rainforest, but
Right.
the majority of Africa is not tropical rainforest.
Mhm.
It's not. Most of it looks more like the Sudan,
Wow.
and around the Sahara, than kind of a very lush, kind of that lush, verdant tropical rainforest. I think it's only like 8% of Africa is that kind of lush tropical rainforest. Most of it is more desert-like.
Mhm.
And even when you get close to water, like the Red Sea or
Mhm.
kind of near the bottom of the Sudan. Yeah, I guess it's still the Red Sea. It's still, I remember years and years ago, I'm sorry, I'm very old, but years and years ago when Marines were in Somalia, people were just like, where's the jungle? And I was just, there is no rainforest in Somalia. It's like much of the rest of Africa. It's a kind of a drier and kind of more
Mhm.
savanna or Sahel kind of situation. So it might help kind of in terms of writing the perception of uh, the topography or the
Right.
ecological kind of situation for some people looking at it.
So I think there's this idea in America, like too many Tarzan movies, right? Kind of shaping that perception, right? In a sense.
Yeah, or just this idea of a particular place that a lot of, I think, places of things have been shot, which is kind of more, or the heart of darkness of
Yeah.
idea,
Yeah.
that it is
Mm.
a very small proportion of what Africa looks like,
And I just
the
also
African
like
dream
from
looks like.
Yeah, I just also like cinemagraphically, right? That, that this is also a presentation of Africa, really, that, the focal point of the narrative is not some type of, unrest, not some type of threat to violence. It's just, the culture itself and this kind of day-to-day life, right? That I thought was just beautiful about that. So extending from that too, a couple of things I wanted to ask you. One, about the way the film kind of engages with the characters dealing with kind of blind faith in religion, but then also superstition existing in those places as well too. Could you speak on that a little bit, particularly with mom, Salika? She, very much so is a woman of faith, but also too the belief that her son, is going to die at 20 because what happens when she takes him to be blessed is just really kind of interesting to say, because, religion, from a Christian standpoint, right, we're often told, right, that superstition, you don't believe those things if your faith is strong. And so how do you kind of reconcile that in terms of African culture?
I also think that there's a whole lot of superstition going on in Christian cultures that we don't recognize as superstition.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Or that we don't recognize as, or that we don't kind of see as something, I don't know, maybe it's not extra biblical. I don't know how to talk about this, but, the whole idea, my mother passed away 6 years ago, and my sister, who is kind of more of a church going kind of person than I am, constantly talking about signs that she thinks that she sees that my mother is around. And one of the things that she thinks she is butterflies. She always thinks that a butterfly is my mother. And I'm just like, which butterfly? because I'm not kind of steeped in that and that kind of spirituality. So I always like to be a little bit careful with that, because I think there's a whole lot of superstition and people kind of having a popular sense of spirituality that isn't necessarily always in kind of spiritual text.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one thing that I thought was interesting about the film, because Muzamil seems to have, because he gets kind of hooked up with his sheikh and he is memorizing the Quran, he seems to be kind of more of a kind of Quranically, kind of every once in a while. At one point he's talking about, somebody says something about a spirit or something, and he's like, yes, that is in the Quran, so that's something that I can kind of endorse or something like that. But so I haven't seen the film several times, so I was trying to figure out if he obviously kind of believed that he was going to die at 20, because he wasn't willing to take a chance and be in this relationship with this, young woman who loved him so much and was really trying to kind of shape him and shake him out of this, or at least to have as much kind of love in his life as he could,
right?
Even if he still believed this. But there are often, but in all of these contexts, you can find people who are more by the book, and some people who are more going towards kind of popular notion of spirituality and kind of more interested in these kinds of things. The Sudanese people that I have come into contact with, and we haven't talked a whole lot about those kinds of things, but I didn't get a sense of that kind of level of belief in and something that also seemed very kind of synchronic to me as well, because the man who's kind of twirling and falls out, he is not dressed in a very Islamic Muslim manner. And then when the mother goes to have this kind of ritual done, and I think the subtitle is kind of an exorcism or something like that. What I forgot what they call it. Yeah, so this is something that harkens back to a form of spirit possession
Mhm.
that comes from pre-Islamic African spirituality and traditional
Mhm.
kind of medicine and religion, and that a lot of people locate the beginning of it in the Sudan and or Ethiopia, but especially the Sudan, and it's something called kind of czar, and then kind of spreads to other places around Africa. In Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, there is a practice called, my brain is so bad these days, I'm losing it. There's a practice called, it's a practice that has to do with uh, your body being inhabited by a spirit,
Excerpt.
and it's akin to czar, but when the spirit comes over you, it has an ability to kind of lift your spirits, to make you more bold, it might be a spirit of a different gender, it might be a spirit of a different race, it might be a spirit from a different time period. So and it can help women be more bold in their action or their belief or things that they're trying to do. And sometimes you live with the spirit and try to give things to it that will help you kind of live with it. And then there are some people who kind of want to get rid of it, but
I thought it was really interesting in the film that the mother just bought into that hook, line, and sinker. I mean, started dressing in black, and I think about the elders.
Comes over her face when it first
Yes,
happens. It's just
yes.
so
And she
intense.
seems to get locked into that kind of facial expression throughout the rest of the film. She's miserable. I mean, she's like already grieving in a sense, right? And I think it's so interesting that the elders in that community are like, you have to let this child live, right? The one, I think about the one scene where the older elder in the community says to her, she goes, well, you wear white all the time. She says, yeah, but I wear white for my son that has died. Your son is alive and you're already, you're wearing black for him, right? So I always felt the way that the elders in that community never really bought into the fact that he was going to die when he was 20 in some ways.
They seem ambivalent to me
Yeah,
about
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
That same woman also gives him something
The
and says,
sandalwood. The sandalwood incense for his funeral. It's almost like, well, just in case, here you go. Yeah, yeah. It was very weird. Like, I guess they didn't want to try it. They didn't want to challenge it or push the boundary of it too much, just in case. But yeah, it was really but the mother, her face being locked in that way, I just thought was really interesting.
When she gives him that sandalwood, you can also see he wasn't having that kind of a day or that kind of a time, and then he's reminded of it again.
Yes.
So
yeah, right when it's this constant reminder, as soon as he does try to live a life, if you will, for sure. So in extension of that with Muzamil, I really love his relationship with Suleiman, who has his own issues, right? He's been maligned by the community and kind of ostracized, if you will, kind of living on the periphery. And, even his Muzamil's mother even tells him, like, don't go see that man anymore. That man has a bad reputation and such. What did you think about Muzamil and Suleiman's relationship? And do you think it kind of challenged some of the conventional notions of patriarchy, or did it kind of, still buy into that? But even though he was introducing him to things like film and, kind of broadening his perspective about sin and about religion and things like that, what'd you think of that relationship?
I thought it was interesting because it seems like it kind of leads him to the end of the film to chase this bus that can take him away from the village and to kind of see other things. But at the same time, I didn't think of it as challenging patriarchy, because a man can live that way,
right?
But a woman would have a much harder time. And people can say in a lot of the context that I've been in, oh, he's not doing the right thing. He's not being a good Muslim. Although a lot of times people are hesitant to say that. It's God who needs to judge him. But if a woman was doing that kind of thing, it's we who need to judge her.
Right.
And so I didn't see it as as something that would challenge
I
patriarchy.
guess a better way would have said maybe he was kind of challenging. I should have said it this way, maybe the way Suleiman kind of got him to challenge the more conventional traditions or beliefs of that particular community, I guess would be a better way to state that. Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah.
That I thought was interesting. I kept thinking of the question about dedicating it to the Sudanese revolution.
Yeah.
Because in some ways it's also hearkening back to before the regime, before the Bashir regime, before, because a lot of people talk to me about that. Oh, Khartoum, especially American and European researchers. Oh, Khartoum used to be this beautiful stop that you could make between going to further east, or being in Arabia, or being up further in Syria or somewhere else, and then coming back home. Khartoum used to be this beautiful stop that you could make in between there, where there were beautiful hotels and you could sit down beside the pool and have a drink and have a talk and kind of bask in this beautiful city that was Khartoum. And it seems to me that his filming is of that time period as well.
So then, to kind of extend on that, and to ask the question proper, do you think this becomes kind of he does this in tribute to that, right? So do you think what specifically, you're saying he's speaking to the kind of past elements of that time, pre-revolution? Is that what he's paying tribute to?
Not just pre-revolution, but pre the Islamic Republic in the Sudan too, kind of pre pre this. My goodness, I keep losing this man's name. My brain is really bad today. I've had pre the dictator that was kind of who got overthrown in the Sudanese revolution. I've already said his name several times and now it's just got out of my head. But so I think, and I wondered if he was wondering if it was going to be another flowering of Khartoum and film and music and dancing, right? They have, he kind of points to, what is it, Samar Gamal, and says, oh, she was this wonderful dancer, right? And so I'm wondering if it's kind of a thinking that another golden era might come for kind of more diverse arts and a flowering of that kind of thing in the Sudan.
You were talking about al-Bashir, right? Omar al-Bashir.
Al-Bashir, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so what kind of, in thinking about that too, back to kind of talking about Suleiman, him kind of being ostracized the way that he was, right? Kind of like, how, what is he, in terms of him in the film, kind of connected to Muzamil, who already kind of has, this kind of, his life is stunted in some way because he's waiting to die, basically. What does Suleiman represent to you in the film, particularly in terms of the way we think about masculinity and culture and such?
Sorry, could you kind of say, what does Suleiman represent?
Yeah, I mean, because he's on the periphery of all of this tradition and whatever else, and Muzamil learns the most from him, right? Even though he's told that he should not engage with him, or go to his house and deliver this and don't tell anybody you went there, but
yeah, again, I thought it's kind of a hearkening back to when the Sudan was more open to the world
Okay.
than it had been before. It's
Yeah.
or at least as an American, it was very hard to get into the Sudan.
Okay.
I put in for a visa 2 months before I left the United States. I didn't have it by the time I got to Egypt. I stayed in Egypt for a workshop for 2 weeks. I still didn't have it. I applied to the Sudanese embassy in Egypt in order to go to Sudan. I still didn't have it. I stayed after the workshop for several weeks, still didn't get it. And then it was, by then I was told that my visa had come through in the United States. So I did something kind of scary, and I sent my passport with someone else on a plane to New York. So I was sitting in Egypt without a passport. And I sent it to somebody else. They went that day. Luckily, the person was landing during a weekday. They went that day to the Sudanese embassy, got my visa, and FedExed it or couriered it back to me.
Wow.
So I was out without my visa for about, I think, 2 or 3 days.
Wow.
Without my passport for 2 or 3 days.
Wow. That's really, this kind of speaks to the
At
kind
least as an American, and I think also as if you were coming from Europe, it was very hard to get into the Sudan. And like I said, I only had a visa to be in Khartoum. And if you wanted to go outside of Khartoum, you had to get another special visa, and you had to go to the police station in order to do so.
Okay. Man, it's rough. So here's something I want to also mention about this. So one of the most interesting scenes in this movie to me is a part of the film where it kind of either homoeroticism is suggested, or if anything, kind of unsolicited sexual contact. That when when Muzamil is brought to the sheik, this guy, and he kind of caresses his torso the way they did, and told him that he could, he should stay there with him or whatever. How do you read that scene? Because, or what comment is there something specific that you think the director is trying to say here about Sudanese culture, about where we are in the time in terms, the way times have shifted and changed? Because the reason I asked it is because it doesn't
naive about it, but I thought that scene came a little bit after the scene where the boys kind of throw him down and scrub him with sand.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a ritual cleaning before burial.
Yeah, because they mummified him too as a little boy.
I could be wrong about that, because you can clean with sand and you can clean with water.
But it was,
and then now and then the sheikh is kind of using water on him. And I've never seen anybody, but I've never seen just kind of all male interaction. And it's usually, I don't think, males that clean bodies for burial.
Well, and that's what I
didn't know if it was hearkening back to that at all, because after that, I was expecting to see the sheikh in more scenes and him interacting with him.
That's what I was going to.
Some kind of more kind of one-on-one kind of teaching or learning. And even that scene, it wasn't one-on-one. There were the two kind of people with, and I guess he wasn't even really the real sheikh, right? He was his assistant who was there while the sheikh was away.
Well, that's what because the director doesn't allude to that scene anymore, but I think it's really different. But like the scene that you're mentioning when they were kids, I mean, that happened when he was a little boy. They attempted to mummify him. They'd already been kind of, teasing him about being the dead boy or whatever else, and did that. But this is after he made that beautiful scene, always that shot where he shows the mother and then the boys at different ages to make that transition that Muzamil is getting older. But then that scene happens when Muzamil is of age, is coming to his masculinity or his manhood or his older, older, and the way that happens, and it seems such a one-off, and that's why I thought there was something. And I've read some other places where a lot of people have read that as kind of read that scene is, read that scene quite sexually, and so I was wondering. Yeah, how you saw that, but that's interesting.
I kind of watched that scene a couple of times just to kind of see what I was
Mhm.
So I think it certainly could be seen in that way. And I mean, certainly there are there is there can be sexual abuse and all kinds of it, abuse of kind of young uh boys who are kind of sent to these kinds of schools
Mhm.
to, but a lot of times that's, I think of that as more rife for any kind of abuse, not being fed, being sent out to beg for your meals. That's something that happens in Nigeria an awful lot. But that usually happens when a young boy is living in this context
Mhm.
most of the time and doesn't go home to his family.
Which is what the sheik said to him. Remember, he said, "You should stay here with me." He
He
doesn't
does.
though, but
Yeah. So, so yeah, I'm not, it might have been a hint at the fact that this is kind of one of the dangers or something. I think that can especially happen to young men who are not under the protection of their fathers.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting for sure. Yeah, which we know, right? He wasn't, and the father, of course, comes back after a while, and it's a strained relationship between he and Muzamil. Uh,
Which
do
is also kind of interesting that Suleiman comes back and then the father comes
the
back
father?
and they
Yeah.
have been kind of peers,
Mhm.
but coming back from being in different places and doing different things. The
Right.
life of an artist and then the life of a guest worker.
Right, right. And the fact that, and the way in which kind of, Musa kind of read that as the father kind of like abandoning him, right? And saying that, Suleiman is more of a father to me than you are, he makes that big, which the father doesn't say anything to, I guess he doesn't feel like.
He also frames it in that way when he leaves.
Yes, he does. He absolutely does. Yeah. And the way the mother, Sakina, on one hand, right, is glad to have him back, but she also too is angry. I love that you mentioned earlier, like kind of the ambivalence of how the family, the elders in that community kind of felt about, the fact that, is he dying at that age or not? But then just kind of that ambivalence happens in a lot of places in the film, right? That people, feel one way, but they also feel another about how things have turned out, for sure. Yeah. What do you think about, in terms of like the agency that women have in this film? I mean, we know, you kind of mentioned, like, this is largely a space that's, very much so considered patriarchal or male centered, but the women have a lot of agency in this film, particularly Sakina, who's, she's quiet to some degree, but when it's time to speak, she absolutely does. What do you think about the way women are centered in this film?
I thought that I guess a couple of things about it.
Mhm.
One is that household, I think in a lot of time, in a lot of societies, the household is seen as this women's space.
Mhm.
And since she's trying to kind of she's believing it, but also it seems like she's trying to protect him from it at
Yeah.
the same time.
Yeah, it
But
is.
why would you
Yes.
protect him from it at 10 when it's the the prophecy or whatever is for 19?
Mhm.
Um, uh, and so that seemed kind of natural for something that's kind of within the household a lot. And then also, it seemed natural to me too, because when you have, although the whole community was not this way, or I'm not sure if the
Mhm.
whole if there were more men who were in this situation as
Mhm.
well, that when you have a community where men go off to do kind of migrate for work, the in all kinds of contexts, they kind of the burden of the society
Mhm.
of kind of giving these men uh uh of keeping the home fires burning, sometimes if men come and go, because oftentimes that's, I think, more what happens. People come and go. Oh, I've been in this context, I'm coming home, and then I'm going to another context. You know, what did they say? He'd been to Senegal and kind of all of these other kind of places. More oftentimes they kind of touch home, I think, before they go to other places. And women are the ones who have to kind of uphold home and to I'm trying to, and this is something that I'm more used to reading about in South Africa, especially in the bad old days of apartheid, when people had to kind of go away from these kind of Bantustans and that kind of thing in order to find work and come back. Women had to kind of hold down the farm and the household, and when men weren't quite making enough money or something, kind of to feed them, and then also to keep communications with them in order to kind of keep up their spirits and their contact with home and these kinds of things. So it's just more of a double burden that women often have in several different contexts around the world. So that was the way I was kind of saying it.
Did you get the impression, though, that the father kind of initially, after the kind of death sentence had been placed on Muzamil, kind of exiled himself a little bit to kind of not have to deal with that, and then it all kind of snowballed from there with him having to go to these different places for work, or to find work?
Something about somebody else. Was it his brother who had passed away?
Yeah. Something to that. Yeah, he had talked about
drowned in the So it seemed like, something that I hopefully no one on this call has experienced, but I know that friends of mine have experienced that they've had kind of good friends who have been for them, have had good friends for long periods of time, and then they end up having, it often happens around cancer for in my personal circle. I had a friend who had cancer, and she had a very good friend whose mother had died of cancer. And so the good friend said, I can't go through this again. And so she just cut her off. And it seemed like that's what he was doing. I can't go through this death. I can't, I think he said it at one point, right?
He did.
I can't live with death hanging over my head again. So I'm going to leave.
And he did. And it doesn't come back until, as we know, until Muzamil is, 17, 18 years old, he doesn't come back, and that's a long while, which of course would speak to, like you say, that chasm between he and his son, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
And then also what Sakina has to kind of go through in order to keep her household up and
then running, like, what another thing that struck me about this is the way we get this, briefly, this love story. We touched on it a little bit, against an African backdrop, and once again, like a legitimate love story, like unrequited love, and which is kind of, we see these moments of, superstition, like, oh, I don't swim in the Nile because there's crocodiles in there. Like, he's really adamant about, protecting himself, much in the same way his mother has protected him. Like, so even though not until he's 19, should he be worrying about these things per se, right? But what did you think about the way, and then the way they talked about the arranged marriage situation, how that tradition kind of poked his head, was kind of waiting for him to say something? How did you think? What did you think about that relationship he has? Which clearly, right, starts from when they're young kids, that they're interested in each other, or there's an affection or an adoration there.
But it seemed, I was kind of surprised at the way in which and the way in which she was kind of portrayed. When I looked at her, I just didn't see most of the Sudanese friends before. She was much bolder. She just had a different look to her in terms of the way she was like wearing her hair. I was kind of surprised. I wasn't quite sure what her relationship was with the young man who said, "Oh, we've apologized to you for doing this to you in the past." Because I was
Yeah,
just like, why is she not, why does she not, why is she, why is she
uncovered.
not covered when
Yeah.
she's talking to this man? And at some point she was in the village, like outside of her house, and she wasn't covered. So
Yeah.
she just, I just found her very perplexing.
Yeah,
I
well,
have to say, but I liked also kind of her boldness and
mhm.
kind of trying to go after and mold the life and trying to, because at one point, right, she's trying to get him to intervene before.
Yes. Before she has to marry that guy, and he doesn't, out of
Yeah,
fear, he doesn't say anything. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, but that brings me to another question, Ashley, before we open the floor up to questions to other people here. But I mean, one of the things I really love about this movie too is the way they preference the relationship with the young boy that has Down syndrome. I've never seen that in a like American film, but like international film, and like to see something like that. I mean, he's prominent, right? Kind of part of their collective, part of their
As
narrative.
a young boy, they have
Yes.
the young actor and then the
And then they
older
have an
actor
older
as
one.
well.
I love that they did that. I just want to say that. But I read online a few people that were not very happy with this film because they felt like it was kind of constructed for the consumption of a Western audience. Did you see that, or do you see more accuracies in the portrayal than you do maybe compromises in it?
I just haven't seen, I have seen no Sudanese film, so
Mm,
I didn't feel like
right.
I had anything to compare it to.
Mhm.
And then although I thought, kind of adding in the Suleiman who's coming in kind of from the West,
Mhm.
or yeah, from being in, I hate that word, from being in kind of Paris and
Mhm.
and in Europe and the like, might have been that, especially since he has such a sympathetic portrayal,
Mhm.
and in the movie. And I did actually attempt to ask my friend about this, but I haven't kind of heard back from her, and I don't know if she's kind of seen the film or
Mhm.
not. But and she's kind of lived in Canada she lived in Canada for a long period of time. Actually, she basically got exiled from uh from the Sudan, and she just recently went back to the Sudan after the revolution, and she is kind of training young women in kind of feminist thought and action and activism now in the Sudan, which and kind of being very inspired by the work that she does and the reaction that she's getting from these young Sudanese women. So
Oh,
I
wow.
I found that to be a kind of very much a real change.
Yeah, and because I asked because specifically the way you were talking about the young lady, like her not being covered and things like that, and the way she was engaging with these men. And I thought, is that a way of trying to, maybe modernize this film in some way
I
for
Yeah,
audience?
or to kind of give a more familiar figure or something like that
Right, right,
somewhere.
right.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Mhm.
And then I also felt like there was no kind of judgment upon her in any way, shape, or
Right.
you know what I mean, throughout the film. Nobody talked about her, oh, why aren't you covered?
Yeah.
Or I guess I just can't remember anybody kind of policing her or
Yeah.
judging her or making sure this or that is happening, when I
Mhm.
know in the places, the context that I have been in the past,
Mhm.
um sometimes if a young girl is going out or doing something, especially as she's kind of transitioning from when she should always be covered outside, or
Mhm.
becoming uh
Mhm.
eligible to be married, or
Mhm.
seeing a young woman, those things can, people can stop saying things like that.
Yeah. I think it speaks a little bit to that ambivalence you were kind of mentioning earlier in other places in the film, that here on one hand, she's in this arranged marriage that's about to happen. And then there are these other ways where she's not traditional at all, in terms of being uncovered and stuff. So yeah, I wonder like kind of why, and I didn't find anything to kind of explain his thinking about that, the director's thinking about choosing to do that. But yeah, but I'm like you, I liked her boldness too. And I like that she kept trying to prod him to, she never says, she doesn't, come right out and say it until a little later, she kind of says more, but she really is trying to prod him to step up so they can be together, but he just can't. He can't do it. He can't do it. He can't. So I'd like to open the floor to any questions you might have about the film that you'd like to pose to Dr. Hutson, or maybe me, or we can answer.
Or if there's anything that you kind of push back or challenge.
No, yeah, absolutely. Maybe you read something differently than the way that we talked about it. Any comments? Anything?
I see a hand up.
Do we? Where? Do we? Where?
Michelle?
Is it Michelle? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I thought you had a hand.
That's the hand is my my cursor. Sorry.
Okay. I was like, oh, is she? Was there anything like, those of you who may watch the film, anything that stood out to you that you thought was particularly effective in the film that maybe we could talk about or address? Something you may have liked or thought interesting or didn't understand, maybe? No?
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead, Hannah.
This might just be me being ignorant and not knowing, but you were just talking about the girl that he was interested. I forgot her name. And I thought her relationship was interesting with his mother, particularly the scene where she comes in and she's like, oh, I came for tea. And she just waits for the mom to go offer. She's like, okay, I'll go make it for you. I guess I just don't know like what those types of relationships are like. And like if that's normal, because I was kind of taken aback by it, like, oh, go make me tea. And maybe it didn't come off like that to other people. But yeah.
Dr. Hudson, is there any kind of like in African culture, like protocol like that, particularly a young lady that I like your son, ma'am?
That it was kind of it's a little strange. I don't know Sudanese society well enough to say it's completely strange, but you don't drop in and have that kind of relationship with people who are older than you are, unless it's a well-established kind of, I guess in anthropology people would talk about it as kind of some kind of fictive kinship relationship, where they're your I guess in African-American society people would say they're your play mom or your play aunt or something like that, and that just comes kind of out of the blue. So I felt like I didn't have enough information from it, so it did seem a little strange. But if you have that, if you have that kind of relationship where you just feel an affinity to somebody who's not your mother, not your aunt, and you kind of like to hang out at their house, but usually that's something that you can do if there are other younger people there as well. And then after that, if they kind of reciprocate, but still that's something that's kind of hard, because in just a lot of kind of African social context, you just don't have that kind of relationship with somebody who's older than you are.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of like,
you're on an equal kind of age and kind of socioeconomic status or something like that. That's something that you can do, because if you come in, although yeah, if you come in, it's also usually you'd either be like, oh, I just dropped in to do this kind of thing. So people know that they don't have to offer you hospitality. But if you come in and it's obvious that you're there for kind of to check in on them, to have a chat or something like that, it's not something that you even have to ask. Somebody's going to be like, oh, I'll go and make tea. So I thought, so maybe it is, Hannah, like you talked about, it is a little rude because she's younger than she is, than the mother, and she had to say, oh, I'm here to kind of hang out with you, which is something that, you know, generally wouldn't happen otherwise, just because of the age difference.
That's interesting. I'd like to, you know, there's not a lot of interviews of him talking about the film, the director. I really would, if I ever met, like, you know, what was his thinking about in the creation of that character? Because she is pushing boundaries in a whole lot of ways in the film.
And in order to kind of, but there are, you know, I think a lot of people have met that kind of strong personality who's just, they do it in such a way that people accept it, but they've just got that kind of strong personality that where they can step a little bit outside the boundary, but she's not way out there.
Right.
But yeah, so obviously the mother didn't seem like that's something that they did quite often or something, but she's really trying to get the mother on her side, because of course in an arranged marriage it gets arranged at a different level. But and there can be some kind of chatting between the mothers, but at some point the kind of uncle or a father or somebody has to usually get pulled into for that thing, is the way in which I understand it. So
I think
it can't just purely be an understanding between kind of mothers.
I was gonna say, I think the young lady's name is Naima, or Naima. Yeah, well, yeah.
Oh, right.
She is an interesting character for sure. Yeah. Any other questions that you have for us?
I do.
Yes.
I guess with the culture, I noticed in one of the scenes, I cannot remember both their names, but I guess the older man that kind of takes the boy in and shows him these films. It looks like they're kind of living they're having a relationship and they're not married, because in one of the scenes she gets upset. He goes, "What's this on your wrist?" And then he makes the comment about henna. I didn't know that you know, single women were not allowed to wear the henna, because I had to look it up, like what did she mean by that? But it also was interesting that they would even show a scene like that because of their culture. I didn't think men and women could live in that type of way. I guess I was trying to figure out, like, why would they even shine a light on, you know, the living in sin type of dynamic.
Yeah, but I also didn't have an understanding that she was living there full time, because it seems like she kept coming and going. And whereas for Sakina and the older woman, you're always seeing them in the context, mostly in the context of the house. It seemed like going out of the house instead of coming in from somewhere else, coming in from somewhere else, coming in from somewhere else. So I wasn't quite sure what was kind of going on there. And if
did you think she was a prostitute?
Sneaking out from somewhere else, but did
you think Dr. Hutson, did you think she was a prostitute?
I think
she too is on the periphery, like, of that community.
You know, I guess I kind of noted it in my mind, but that wasn't the kind of it wasn't a question. I was perplexed by her, because I don't know enough about the way in which kind of sex work or prostitution kind of works within a Sudanese rural context, especially.
She also has that other moment with him when Muzamil comes to him in tears and he sends him away and tells him that he's, I don't want to see you crying, blah, blah. And she kind of gets on him for being hard on him. And then she kind of, they seem very domesticated, the two of them, even though, like you say, she's in and out of that place. Yeah.
You hardly ever, you just see her lounging. I think I only noted it one time when he's kind of looking at the old footage and then kind of looks over and she is kind of getting ready or something like that. But it just always seemed like she was coming in from somewhere and not, yeah. So yeah, I wasn't quite sure. And like I said, I just don't know enough about that kind of about that kind of context, especially in a rural area and in the Sudan, to kind of know how that would happen. Like in northern Nigeria, there are women who do sex work. It's oftentimes you see them in kind of nightclubs in cities, but whenever I've been in a rural context in northern Nigeria, in a Muslim context, if there were women engaged in sex work, they certainly weren't kind of pointed out to me. They were all kind of family groupings. And there are some contexts in Africa, but again, in urban contexts, where the sex work takes on a very domestic looking situation, where it's not just sex work, but somebody would come in and kind of be there for days. And it's
like
not
companionship.
Just
instead of it being sex work, it's more like a companionship arrangement.
It's more than that. You're also getting meals and laundry, and so you're coming in and kind of living in like coupledom for kind of maybe a couple of weeks at a time or something like that. And then and again, it's in the context of an urban environment and an environment in which there are migrant workers.
Okay.
Might not be able to find a room and a place to live and all of those and the comforts of home somewhere else, but not in a rural context where somebody's coming to you, as opposed to you having the house in which you can kind of set all of these things up, cooking and cleaning, and people knowing that you're there and that you're in kind of a stable environment. And like I said, I just don't know it in a rural context at all.
I think that may probably be aligned to kind of like some of the criticisms I read online, like things like that, not being completely fidelitous to, what life is like in those areas.
And especially in a rural context, that really kind of threw me.
Right. And I can also see where that might be, right, kind of, to a more, particularly I think of like an American audience, right? Where these kinds of things that we're mentioning and kind of having some difficulty with from a narrative standpoint, character development standpoint, right? Like, what does that mean? Why is that like that? For sure. Wow. Well, Dr. Hutson, I have to say, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your expertise and the insight you provided for this film. Just maybe in our last couple of minutes, I want to ask, what do you think is, the big thing or message we should take away from this film?
I guess
Putting you on the spot there a little bit.
I think I just kind of saw it as a coming of age film and in some ways like maybe not a love letter, but a kind of a statement of hope about the future in the Sudan. And a statement of hope about the future in the Sudan, that instead of being kind of mired in this idea that you're going to die at 20, and letting that rule your life for too long, that you can get up and fly, you can learn from other kind of people, you can have other kind of contexts come in. There can be these kind of different kind of figures in your life, even if you live in a rural context. And that, yeah, that there are these possibilities, because we don't know what happens to him, right? He's running after it. I was just like, it doesn't look like you're gonna catch that bus.
I know, right? Right.
You're not running fast enough, and it's going faster.
And all
You
the
should have
dust.
started running a little bit before time. It doesn't look like you're gonna catch that bus, but he's trying,
Sure.
you know, and I think that in some ways, I did want to kind of read you a little bit about what my friend wrote. What did she write here? She said, sorry, I thought I had queued it up at one point. Revolution is making a huge difference at all levels, political, social, and economically. Life is tough and very expensive, but I'm hopeful. I don't know how, but I can see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow. That's pretty powerful. I don't know how, but it's kind of like,
especially after she basically was kind of exiled and kind of chased out of the country and lived in Canada for years. So and again, it seems like he sees a way out. And into out of death at 20,
right,
and into other spaces and a longer life. So
I love that. I don't know how, but I'm hopeful. I love that. That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Hutson, for your time. We greatly appreciate it. I'll turn it over to you. Very well. Thank you so much again. Can I just turn it over to Layla or Shireen?
Yeah, thank you so much. Fascinating discussion, and that film bears watching again in light of the discussion you had tonight. And I apologize for all of my technical issues that took me away part of the time. But we appreciate everybody being here, particularly you, Dr. Hutson.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you again for remembering me and for the invite. And I didn't have this film on my radar, so I was kind of happy to see it. And I might have to tap you, kind of maybe Mark or anybody else on the Zoom. I'm teaching for the first time. I'm teaching these 5-week courses, 1 credit 5-week courses for African American History Month, Women's History Month, and now I'm also trying, I understand that April is Arab American History Month. And so I'm looking for Arab American films or movies or TV shows or something. Right now, all I've got is maybe showing a little bit of Rami. Also look at Mo. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Mo, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
That's really good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, wonderful. Great to hear about that.
Yeah. So anybody who can kind of send me information, and I'd like to talk to you, Mark, if you know a little bit more, and Shireen. Yeah, that would be great. So
awesome.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Hope it was helpful.
It was.